The Nature of the Firm by Ronald H. Coase. Economic theory has suffered in the past from a failure to state clearly its assumptions. Economists, in building up a theory, have often omitted to examine the foundations on which it was erected. This examination is, however, essential not only to prevent the misunderstanding and needless controversy which arise from a lack of knowledge of the assumptions on which a theory is based, but also because of the extreme importance for economics of good judgment in choosing between rival sets of assumptions. For instance, it is suggested that the use of the word firm in economics may be different from the use of the term by the plain man. Since there is apparently a trend in economic theory towards starting analysis with the individual firm and not with the industry, it is all the more necessary not only that a clear definition of the word firm should be given, but that its difference from the firm in the real world, if it exists, should be made clear. Mrs. Robinson has said that the two questions to be asked of a set of assumptions in economics are they tractable? And do they correspond with the real world? True, as Mrs. Robinson points out, more often one set will be manageable and the other realistic, yet there may well be branches of theory where assumptions may be both manageable and realistic. It is hoped to show in the following paper that a definition of the firm may be obtained which is not only realistic in that it corresponds to what is meant by firm in the real world, but is tractable by two of the most powerful instruments of economic analysis developed by Marshall, the idea of the margin and that of the substitution, together giving the idea of substitution at the margin. Our definition must, of course, relate to formal relations which are capable of being conceived exactly. First, it is convenient if, in searching for a definition of a firm, we first consider the economic system as it's normally treated by the economists. Let us consider the description of the economic system given by Sir Arthur Salter. The normal economic system works itself. For its current operation, it is under no central control. It needs no central survey. Over the whole range of human activity and human need, supply is adjusted to demand and production to consumption by a process that is automatic, elastic, and responsive. An economist thinks of the economic system as being coordinated by the price mechanism, and society becomes not an organization, but an organism. The economic system works itself. This does not mean that there is no planning by individuals. These exercise foresight and choose between alternatives. This is necessarily so if there is to be order in the system. But this theory assumes that the direction of resources is dependent directly on the price mechanism. Indeed, it is often considered to be an objection to economic planning that it merely tries to do what is already done by the price mechanism. Sir Arthur Salter's description, however, gives a very incomplete picture of our economic system. Within a firm, the description does not fit at all. For instance, in economic theory, we find that the allocation of factors of productions between different uses is determined by the price mechanism. The price of factor A becomes higher in X than in Y. As a result, A moves from Y to X, until the difference between the prices in X and Y, except insofar as it compensates for other differential advantages, disappears. Yet in the real world, we find that there are many areas where this does not apply. If a workman moves from department Y to department X, he does not go because of a change in relative prices, but because he is ordered to do so. Those who object to economic planning on the grounds that the problem is solved by price movements can be answered by pointing out that there is planning within our economic system which is quite different from the individual planning mentioned above, and which is akin to what is normally called economic planning. The example given above is typical of a large sphere in our modern economic system. Of course, this fact has not been ignored by economists. Marshall introduces organization as a fourth factor of production. J.B. Clark gives the coordinating function to the entrepreneur. Professor Knight introduces managers who coordinate. As D. H. Robertson points out, we find islands of conscious power in the ocean of unconscious cooperating, like lumps of butter coagulating in a pail of buttermilk. But in view of the fact that it's usually argued that coordination will be done by the price mechanism, why is such organization necessary? Why are there these islands of conscious power? Outside the firm, price movements direct production, which is coordinated through a series of exchange transactions on the market. Within a firm, these market transactions are eliminated and in place of the complicated market structures with exchange transaction is substituted the entrepreneur coordinator, who directs production. It is clear that these are alternative methods of coordinating production. Yet, having regard to the fact that if production is regulated by price movements, production could be carried on without any organization at all. Well, might we ask, why is there any organization? Of course, the degree to which the price mechanism is superseded varies greatly. In a department store, the allocation of different sections to the various locations in the building may be done by the controlling authority, or it may be the result of competitive price bidding for space. In the Lancashire cotton industry, a weaver can rent power in a shop room and can obtain looms and yarn on credit. This coordination of the various factors of production is, however, normally carried out without the intervention of the price mechanism. As is evident, the amount of vertical integration involving as it does the supersession of the price mechanism varies greatly from industry to industry and from firm to firm. It can, I think, be assumed that the distinguishing mark of the firm is the supersession of the price mechanism. It is, of course, as Professor Robinson points out, related to an outside network of relative prices and costs, but it's important to discover the exact nature of this relationship. This distinction between the allocation of resources in a firm and the allocation in the economic system has been very vividly described by Mr. Maurice Dobb when discussing Adam Smith's conception of the capitalist. It began to be seen that there was something more important than the relations inside each factory or unit captained by an undertaker. There were the relations of the undertaker with the rest of the economic world outside his immediate sphere. The undertaker busies himself with the division of labor inside each firm, and he plans and organizes consciously, but he is related to the much larger economic specialization, of which he himself is merely one specialized unit. Here he plays his part as a single cell in a larger organism, mainly unconscious on the wider rail he feels. In view of the fact that while economists treat the price mechanisms as coordinating instrument, they also admit the coordinating function of the entrepreneur. It is surely important to inquire why coordination is the work of the price mechanism in one case and of the entrepreneur in another. The purpose of this paper is to bridge what appears to be a gap in economic theory between the assumptions made for some purpose, the resources are allocated by means of the price mechanism, and the assumption made for other purposes, that this allocation is dependent on the entrepreneur coordinator. We have to explain the basis on which, in practice, this choice between alternatives is effected. 2. Our task is to attempt to discover why a firm emerges at all in a specialized exchange economy. The price mechanisms, considered purely from the side of the direction of resources, might be superseded if the relationship which replaced it was desired for its own sake. This would be the case, for example, if some people prefer to work under the direction of some other person. Such individuals would accept less in order to work under someone, and firms would arise naturally from this. But it would appear that this cannot be a very important reason, for it would rather seem that the opposite tendency is operating if one judges from the stress normally laid on the advantages of being one's own matter. Of course, if the desire was not to be controlled, but to control, to exercise power over others, then people might be willing to give up something in order to direct others. That is, they would be willing to pay others more than they could get under the price mechanisms in order to be able to direct them. But this implies that those who direct pay in order to be able to do this, and are not paid to direct, which is clearly not true in the majority of cases. Firms might also exist if purchasers prefer commodities which are produced by firms to those not so produced. But even in firms where one could expect such preference, if they exist, to be of negligible importance, firms are to be found in the real world. Therefore, there must be other elements involved. The main reason why it's profitable to establish a firm would seem to be that there is a cost of using the price mechanism. The most obvious cost of organizing production through the price mechanism is that of discovering what the relevant prices are. This cost may be reduced, but it will not be eliminated by the emergence of the specialists who will sell this information. The cost of negotiation and concluding a separate contract for each exchange transaction will take place on a market must also be taken into account. Again, in certain markets, e.g. produce exchanges, a technique is devised for minimizing these contract costs, but they are not eliminated. It is true that contracts are not eliminated when there is a firm, but they are greatly reduced. A factor of production, or the owner thereof, does not have to make a series of contracts with the factors with whom he is cooperating within the firm, as would be necessary, of course, if this cooperation were as a direct result of the workings of the price mechanism. For this series of contracts is substituted one. At this stage, it's important to note the character of the contract into which a factor enters that is employed within a firm. The contract is one whereby the factor, for a certain remuneration, which may be fixed or fluctuating, agrees to obey the directions of the entrepreneur within certain limits. The essence of the contract is that it should only state the limits of the powers of the entrepreneur. Within these limits, he can therefore direct the other factors of production. There are, however, other disadvantages or costs of using the price mechanisms. It may be desired to make a long-term contract for the supply of some article or service. This may be due to the fact that if one contract is made for a longer period, instead of several short ones, then certain costs of making each contract will be avoided, or owing to the risk attitude of the people concerned that may prefer to make a long rather than a short-term contract. Now, owing to the difficulty of forecasting, the longer the period of the contract is for the supply of the commodity or service, the less possible and indeed the less desirable it is for the person purchasing to specify what the other contracting party is expected to do. It may well be a matter of indifference to the person supplying the service or commodity which of several course of action is taken, but will not to the purchaser of the service or commodity. But the purchaser will not know which of the several courses will want to the supplier to take. Therefore, the service which is being provided is expected in general terms, the exact detail being left until a later date. All that is stated in the contract is the limits to what the person supplying the commodity or service is expected to do. The details what the supplier is expected to do is not stated in the contract, but is decided later by the purchaser. When the direction of the resources within the limits of the contract becomes dependent on the buyer in this way, the relationship, which I term a firm, may be obtained. A firm is likely therefore to emerge in those cases where a very short-term contract would be unsatisfactory. It is obvious of more importance in the case of services, labor, than it is in the case of buying of commodities. In the case of commodities, the main items can be stated in advance, and the details which will be decided later will be of minor significance. We may sum up this section of the argument by saying that the operation of the market costs something, and by forming an organization and allowing some authority and entrepreneur to direct the resources, certain market costs are saved. The entrepreneur has to carry out his function at less cost, taking into account the fact that he may get the factors of production at a lower price than the market transactions which he supersedes, because it's always possible to revert to the open market if he fails to do this. The question of uncertainty is one which is often considered to be very relevant to the study of equilibrium of the firm. It seems improbable that a firm would emerge without the existence of uncertainty. But those, for instance, Professor Knight, who make the mode of payment the distinguishing mark of the firm, fixed incomes being guaranteed to some of these engaged in production by a person who takes the residual and fluctuating income, would appear to be introducing a point which is irrelevant to the problem we are considering. One entrepreneur may sell his service to another for a certain sum of money, while the payment to his employees may be mainly or wholly a share in profits. The significant question would appear to be why the allocation of resources is not done directly by the price mechanism. Another factor that should be noted is that exchange transactions on a market and the same transactions organized within a firm are often treated differently by governments or other bodies with regulatory powers. If we consider the operations of a sale tax, it is clear that it is a tax on the market transaction and not on the same transaction organized within the firm. Now, since these are alternative methods of organization, by the price mechanisms or by the entrepreneur, such a regulation would bring into existence firms which otherwise would have no reason d'être. It would furnish a reason for the emergence of a firm in a specialized exchange economy. Of course, to the extent that firms already exist, such a measure as a sales tax would merely tend to make them larger than they would otherwise be. Similarly, quota schemes and methods of price control which imply that there is rationing and which do not apply to firms producing such products for themselves, by allowing the advantages to those who organize within the firm and not through the market, necessarily encourage the growth of firms. But it's difficult to believe that it measures such as have been mentioned in this paragraph, which have brought firms into existence. Such measures would, however, tend to have this result if they did not exist for other reasons. These, then, are the reasons why organizations such as firms exist in a specialized exchange economy, in which it is generally assumed that the distribution of resources is organized by the price mechanism. A firm, therefore, consists of the system of relationships which comes into existence when the direction of resources is dependent on an entrepreneur. The approach which just has been sketched would appear to offer an advantage in that it is possible to give a scientific meaning to what is meant by saying that a firm gets larger or smaller. A firm becomes larger as additional transactions, which could be exchange transactions coordinated through the price mechanisms, are organized by the entrepreneur and become smaller as he abandons the organization of such transactions. The question which arises is whether it is possible to study the forces which determines the size of the firm. Why does the entrepreneur not organize one less transaction or one more? It is interesting to note that Professor Knight considers that. The relation between efficiency and size is one of the most serious problems of theory, being in contrast with the relation for a plant largely a matter of personality and historical accident rather than of intelligible general principles. But the question is peculiarly vital because of the possibility of monopoly gain offers a powerful incentive to continuous and unlimited expansion of the firm, which force must be offset by some equally powerful one making for decreased efficiency in the production of money income with growth in size, if even boundary competition is to exist. Professor Knight would appear to consider that it's impossible to treat scientifically the determinants of the size of the firm. On the basis of the concept of the firm developed above, this task will now be attempted. It was suggested that the introduction of the firm was due primarily to the existence of marketing costs. A pertinent question to ask would appear to be, quite apart from the monopoly considerations raised by Professor Knight, why, if by organizing one can eliminate certain costs and in fact reduce the cost of productions, there are any market transactions at all? Why is not all productions carried on by one big firm? There would appear to be certain possible explanations. First, as a firm gets larger, there may be decreasing returns to the entrepreneur function. That is, the cost of organizing additional transactions within the firm may rise. Naturally, a point must be reached where the cost of organizing an extra transaction within the firm are equal to the cost involved in carrying out the transactions in an open market, or the cost of organizing by another entrepreneur. Secondly, it may be that as transactions which are organized increases, the entrepreneur fails to place the factor of production in the uses where their value is greatest. That is, fails to make the best use of the factors of production. Again, a point must be reached where the loss through the waste of resources is equal to the marketing cost of the exchange transaction in the open market, or to the loss if the transaction was organized by another entrepreneur. Finally, the supply price of one or more of the factors of production may rise because the other advantages of a small firm are greater than those of a large firm. Of course, the actual point where the expansion of the firm ceases might be determined by a combination of the factors mentioned above. The first two reasons given most probably correspond to the economist's phrase of diminishing returns to management. The point has been made in the previous paragraph that a firm will tend to expand until the cost of organizing an extra transaction within the firm becomes equal to the cost of carrying out the same transaction by means of an exchange on the open market, or the cost of organizing in another firm. But if the firm stops its expansion at a point below the cost of marketing in the open market, and at a point equal to the cost of organizing in another firm, in most cases, excluding the case of combination, this will imply that there is a market transaction between those two producers, each of whom could organize it at less than the actual market cost. How is the paradox to be resolved? If we consider an example, the reason for this will become clear. Suppose A is buying a product from B, and that both A and B could organize this marketing transaction at less than its present cost. B, we can assume it's not organizing one process or stage of production, but several. If A therefore wishes to avoid a market transaction, he will have to take over all the process of production controlled by B. Unless A takes over all the process of production, a market transaction will still remain, although it's different product that is bought. But we have previously assumed that as each producer expands, he becomes less efficient. The additional cost of organizing extra transactions increase. It is probable that A's cost of organizing the transaction previously organized by B will be greater than B's cost of doing the same thing. A therefore will take over the whole of B's organization only if his cost of organizing B's work is not greater than B's cost by an amount equal to the cost of carrying out an exchange transaction on the open market. But once it becomes economical to have a market transaction, it also pays to divide production in such a way that the cost of organizing an extra transaction in each firm is the same. Up to now, it has been assumed that the exchange transaction which takes place through the price mechanisms are homogeneous. In fact, nothing could be more diverse than the actual transaction which takes place in our modern world. This would seem to imply that the cost of carrying out exchange transactions through the price mechanisms will vary considerably, as it will also the cost of organizing these transactions within the firm. It seems therefore possible that, quite apart from the question of diminishing returns of costs of organizing certain transactions within the firm, may be greater than the cost of carrying out the exchange transactions in the open market. This would necessarily imply that there were exchange transactions carried out through the price mechanisms, but would it mean that there would have to be more than one firm? Clearly not. For all those areas in the economic system where the direction of resources was not dependent directly on the price mechanisms could be organized within one firm. The factors which were discussed earlier would seem to be important ones, though it is difficult to say whether diminishing returns to management or the rising supply price of factors is likely to be more important. Other things being equal, therefore, a firm will tend to be larger. A. The less the cost of organizing and the lower this cost rises with an increase in the transactions organized. B. The less likely the entrepreneur is to make mistakes, and the smaller the increase in mistakes within an increase in the transactions organized. C. The greater the lowering or the less the rise in the supply price of factors of productions to firms of larger size. Apart from variations in the supply price of factors of productions to firms of different sizes, it would appear that the cost of organizing and the losses through the mistakes will increase with an increase in the spatial distribution of transactions organized, into the similarity of the transactions, and in the probability of change in the relevant prices. As more transactions are organized by an entrepreneur, it would appear that transactions would tend to be either different in kind or in different places. This furnishes an additional reason why efficiency would tend to decrease as the firm gets larger. Inventions would tend to bring factors of production near together, by lessening spatial distribution, tend to increase the size of the firm. Changes like the telephone and the telegraph, which tend to reduce the cost of organizing spatially, would tend to increase the size of the firm. All changes which improve managerial technique will tend to increase the size of the firm. It should be noted that the definition of a firm, which was given above, can be used to give more precise meanings to the terms combination and integration. There is a combination when transactions which were previously organized by two or more entrepreneurs become organized by one. This becomes integration when it involves the organization of transactions which were previously carried out between the entrepreneurs on a market. A firm can expand either or both of these two ways. The whole of the structure of competitive industry becomes tractable by the ordinary techniques of economic analysis. 3. The problem which has been investigated in the previous section has not been entirely neglected by economists, and it is now necessary to consider why the reasons given above for the emergence of a firm in a specialized exchange economy are to be preferred to the other explanations which have been offered. It is sometimes said that the reason for the existence of a firm is to be found in the division of labor. This is the view of Professor Usher, a view which has been adopted and expanded by Mr. Maurice Dubb. The firm becomes the result of increasing complexity of the division of labor. The growth of this economic differentiation creates the need for some integrating force, without which differentiation would collapse into chaos. And it is an integrating force in a differentiated economy that industrial forms are chiefly significant. The answer to this argument is an obvious one. The integrating force in a differentiated economy already exists in the form of the price mechanism. It is perhaps the main achievement of economic science that it has shown that there is no reason to suppose that specialization must lead to chaos. The reason given by Mr. Maurice Dubb is therefore inadmissible. What has to be explained is why one integrating force, the entrepreneur, should be substituted for another integrating force, the price mechanism. The most interesting reason, and probably the most widely accepted, which has been given to explain the fact there are those to be found in Professor Knight's Risk Uncertainty Profits. His view will be examined in some detail. Professor Knight starts with a system in which there is no uncertainty. Acting as individuals under absolute freedom, but without collusion, men are supposed to have organized economic life with the primary and secondary division of labor, the use of capital, etc., developed to the point familiar in present-day America. The principal fact which calls for the exercise of the imagination is the internal organization of the productive groups or establishments. With uncertainty entirely absent, every individual being in possession of perfect knowledge of the situation, there would be no occasion for anything of the nature of responsible management or control of the productive activity. Even marketing transactions in any realistic sense would not be found. The flow of raw materials and productive service to the consumers would be entirely automatic. Professor Knight says that we can imagine this adjustment as being the result of a long process of experimentation worked out by trial and error methods alone. While it is not necessary to imagine every worker doing exactly the right thing at the right time in a sort of pre-established harmony with the works of others, there might be managers, superintendents, etc., for the purpose of coordinating the activities of individuals, though these managers would be performing a purely routine function, without responsibility of any sort. Professor Knight then continues, with the introduction of uncertainty, the fact of ignorance and the necessity of acting upon opinion rather than knowledge, into this Eden-like situation, its characters entirely change. With uncertainty present doing things, the actual execution of activity becomes in a real sense a secondary part of life. The primary problem of function is deciding what to do and how to do it. The fact of uncertainty brings about the two most important characteristics of social organization. In the first place, goods are produced for a market on the basis of entirely impersonal predictions of wants, not for the satisfaction of the wants of the producers themselves. The producer takes the responsibility of forecasting the consumer's wants. In the second place, the work for forecasting and at the same time a large part of the technological direction and control of production are still further concentrated upon a very narrow class of the producers. And we meet with a new economic functionary, the entrepreneur. When uncertainty is present and the task of deciding what to do and how to do it takes the ascendancy over the execution of internal organization of the production groups, is no longer a matter of indifference or mechanical detail. Centralization of deciding and controlling functions is an imperative. A process of civilization is inevitable. The most fundamental change is the system under which the confident and venturesome assume the risk or insure the doubtful and timid by guaranteeing to the latter a specified income in return for an assignment of the actual results. With human nature as we know it, it would be impractical or very unusual for one man to guarantee to another a definite result of the latter's actions without being given power to direct his work. And on the other hand, the second party would not place himself under the direction of the firm without such guarantee. The result of this manifold specialization of function is the enterprise and the wage system of industry. Its existence in the world is the direct result of the facts of uncertainty. These quotations give the essence of Professor Knight's theory. The fact of uncertainty means that people have to forecast future wants. Therefore, you get a special class springing up who direct the activities of others to whom they give guaranteed wages. It acts because good judgment is generally associated with confidence in one's judgment. Professor Knight would appear to leave himself open to criticism on several grounds. First of all, as he himself points out, the fact that certain people have better judgment or better knowledge does not mean that they can only get an income from it by themselves actively taking part in production. They can sell advice or knowledge. Every business buys the service of a host of advisors. We can imagine a system where all the advice or knowledge was brought as required. Again, it's possible to get a reward from better knowledge or judgment not by actively taking part in production, but by making contracts with people who are producing. A merchant buying for future delivery represents an example of this. But this merely illustrates the point that it's quite possible to give a guarantee reward providing that certain acts are performed without directing the performance of those acts. Professor Knight says that with human nature as we know it, it would be impracticable or very unusual for one man to guarantee to another a definite result of the latter's actions without being given power to direct his work. This is surely incorrect. A large portion of jobs are done to contract, that is, the contractor is guaranteed a certain sum providing he performs certain acts. But this does not involve any direction. It does mean, however, that a system of relative price has been changed and that there will be a new arrangement of those factors of production. The fact that Professor Knight mentions that the second party would not place himself under the direction of the first without such guarantee is irrelevant to the problem we are considering. Finally, it seems important to notice that even in the case of an economic system where there is no uncertainty, Professor Knight considers that there would be coordinators, though they would perform only a routine function. He immediately adds that they would be without responsibility of any sort, which raises the question by whom are they paid, and why it seems that nowhere does Professor Knight gives a reason why the price mechanism should be superseded. Fourth, it would seem important to examine one further point, and that is consider the relevance of the discussion to the general question of the cost curve of the firm. It has sometimes been assumed that the firm is limited in size under perfect competition if its cost curve slopes upward, while under imperfect competition it is limited in size because it will not pay to produce more than the output at which marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. But it's clear that a firm may produce more than one product, and therefore there appears to be no prima facie reason why this upward slope of the cost curve in the case of perfect competition, or the fact that marginal cost will not always be below marginal revenue in the case of imperfect competition, should limit the size of the firm. Mrs. Robinson makes the simplifying assumption that only one product is being produced, but it's clearly important to investigate how the number of products produced by a firm is determined, while no theory which assumes that only one product is in fact produced can have very great practical significance. It might be replied that under perfect competition, since everything that is produced can be sold at the prevailing price, then there is no need for any other product to be produced. But this argument ignores the fact that there may be a point where it is less costly to organize the exchange transactions of a new product than to organize further exchange transactions of the old product. This point can be illustrated in the following way. Imagine following von tuning there is in a town, consuming the center, and the industries are located around his central point in ring. These conditions are illustrated in the following diagram, in which A and B and C represent different industry. Imagine an entrepreneur who starts controlling exchange transactions from X. Now, as he extends his activities in the same product, B, the cost of organizing increases until at some point it becomes equal to that of the similar product which is near. As the firm expands, it will therefore from his point include more than one product, A and C. This treatment of the problem is obviously incomplete, but it's necessary to show that merely proving that the cost curve turns upward does not give a limitation to the size of the firm. So far we have only considered the case of perfect competition. The case of imperfect competition would appear to be obvious. To determine the size of the firm, we have to consider the marketing costs, that is, the cost of using the price mechanisms and the cost of organizing of different entrepreneurs, and then we can determine how many products will be produced by each firm and how much each of it will be produced. It would therefore appear that Mr. Schoves in his article in Perfect Competition was asking questions of which Mr. Robinson's cost curve apparatus cannot answer. The factors mentioned above would seem to be the relevant ones. 5. One only task now remains, and that is to see whether the concept of a firm which has been developed fits in with the existing in the real world. We can best approach the question of what constitutes a firm in practice by considering the legal relationship normally called of the master and servant, or employer and employee. The essentials of this relationship have been given as follows. First, the servant must be under the duty of rendering personal service to the master, or to others on behalf of the master. Otherwise, the contract is a contract for sale of goods or the like. 2. The master must have the right to control the servant's work, either personally or by another servant or agent. It is this right of control or interference of being entitled to tell the servant when to work within the hours of service and when not to work, and what work to do and how to do it within the terms of such service, which is the dominant characteristic in this relation, and marks off the servant from an independent contractor, or from one employed merely to give his employer the fruits of his labors. In the latter case, the contractor or performer is not under the employer's control in doing the work or effecting the service. He has to shape and manage his work so as to give the result that he was contracted to effect. We thus see that this is the fact of direction, which is the essence of the legal concept of employer and employee, just as it was in the economic concept which was developed above. It is interesting to note that Professor Batts says further, that which distinguishes an agent from a servant is not the absence or presence of a fixed wage, or the payment only of commissions on business done, but rather the freedom which an agent may carry out his employment. We can therefore conclude that the definition we have given is one which approximates closely to the firm as it is considered in the real world. Our definition is therefore realistic. Is it manageable? This ought to be clear. When you are considering how large a firm will be, the principle of marginalism worked smoothly. The question always is, will it pay to bring an extra exchange transaction under the organizing authority? At the margin, the cost of organizing within the firm will be equal either to the cost of organizing in another firm or to the cost involving leaving the transaction to be organized by the price mechanism. Businessmen will be constantly experimenting, controlling more or less, and in this way equilibrium will be maintained. This gives the position of equilibrium for static analysis. But it is clear that the dynamic factors are also of considerable importance, and an investigation of the effect changes have on the cost of organizing within the firm and on the marketing cost generally will enable one to explain why firms get larger and smaller. We thus have a theory of moving equilibrium. The above analysis would also appear to have clarified the relationship between initiative or enterprise and management. Initiative means forecasting and operates through the price mechanisms by making of new contracts. Management proper merely reacts to price changes, rearranging the factors of productions under its control. That the businessman normally combines both functions is an obvious result of the marketing costs which were discussed above. Finally, this analysis enables us to state more exactly what is meant by the marginal product of the entrepreneur, but an elaboration of this point would take us far from our comparatively simple task of definition and clarification. The end. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.